Good day, class. This is the fourth installment of our online lecture series. This will be a two-part video. The first part will be dealing with, as the screen shows, Rome and its rise from a republic to an empire. This lecture will deal with mainly chapter 5 in the textbook, but I'll also throw in some information and some analysis on my point of view. Now, the question that I would pose to you guys: why are Americans especially, but people in the West in general, still fascinated with Rome? I mean, this happened a long time ago, and more than any of the other civilizations that we have talked about so far, people are still fascinated with Rome. I mean, you have movies like Gladiator and the HBO series Spartacus and the previous HBO series Rome. If you really look at it, Star Wars, all 6 parts, are nothing more than telling the story of Rome all over again with spaceships and laser blasters. Well, my view is simple. Americans see a part of themselves in Rome. Political commentators are fascinated with Rome because Rome is analogous to the rise of the United States. Rome started out as a small city-state, became a republic, rose to be one of the most powerful territorial empires the world has ever seen, and influenced not only the territories that it controlled, but also the lands that are around it that it bordered. However, this land empire, this republic that grew too big, if you will, degenerated, and it politically transformed from a republic to an imperial form of government. So it was a land empire, and then it became a political empire. And what does that mean? Well, it meant that power was taken from the republican forms of government, the republican branches, and given, or at least taken by a dictator. And then Rome degenerated, both politically but also socially. And this great empire that had so much potential for revolutionizing the world, that changed the world in so many ways, would collapse into political anarchy. The western half of this empire would completely disappear, leaving behind the people of Europe to have to literally build a new civilization from the rubble of what was Rome. And many people view this as akin to the United States. We started out as 13 colonies. We were created as a democratic republic. Not a pure democracy, but a democratic republic. We have grown to be one of the most influential, politically, economically, and socially, cultures, not only in the Western world, but throughout the globe. The dollar used to be recognized as universal currency. Hollywood and New York advertising were seen everywhere. American TV shows played on everybody's TV sets, even though overseas they may be from 2 or 3 years ago. Politically, Americans, or at least our government, was looked to as the leader of the free world. The question is that still the case across the board? Or are we starting to experience some of the cracks, some of the decline that Rome experienced? Well, today we're going to talk about Rome growing to its zenith. It'll be the next lecture where we talk about where Rome went from that high point of civilization to its decline. So, before we get started, I think I will introduce you guys to the legend of Rome. Now, according to legend, Rome was founded by 2 brothers, Romulus and Remus. These 2 brothers had been left out in the wilderness by the subordinate of an Etruscan king. The Etruscan king had a vision or prophecy that his two sons would seize power from him. So he didn't want that to happen, so he tells a subordinate to take them out and kill them. And he can't bring himself to do it, so the subordinate just leaves them there. Leaves them to die. And a female wolf adopts them and raises them. And as the myth goes, they grow up strong. And they set out, after becoming young adults, to found their own city. However, they get in a fight over what to call it. And Romulus kills Remus, and thus founds Rome, becoming its first king. Well, historians don't rely solely on myth. We try and rely upon fact. And archaeology shows us that Rome is a product of the Etruscans. The Etruscans were an 8th century people that founded Rome as a small city-state. And from the 8th century to the 6th century, so the 500s, Rome is ruled by a hereditary king. However, in 509 BC, the elites of Rome will depose that king. And in the king's place, the Roman elites will craft a constitution. They crafted this constitution so that they would be represented. Because as we'll talk about here in a minute, the initial Roman constitution recognizes the power of the elites of Rome, but really doesn't recognize the other classes in Rome. But this constitution will be the foundation of Rome for the next 500 years. Now, before we talk about the structure of this constitution, let's talk about Rome itself. Why was Rome founded where it was founded? Well, if you look here on this map of the Mediterranean Mediterranean Basin, Rome is right here, right in the center of what is today the Italian peninsula. If you notice, there's this little line right here, that is the Tiber River. Now, Rome, located along the Tiber River here, is ideally placed during this time in human history, because cities that are right on the coast often would fall victim to pirates or raiding by competing civilizations. Well, Rome is not right on the coast. It's inland, but has access to the Mediterranean. So it can benefit from trade with other civilizations, most notably the Greeks. Because one thing I want to point out, if you notice these dates that I'm going to be throwing out, Rome is developing at the same time that classical Greece is developing. Now Rome growing, it will grow as a commercial center, not just because it has access to the sea, but because it has access to Italy itself. This thin line of the Tiber River gives access to not only the sea, but to Italy. To back up here, this isn't a good map in that it doesn't show the topography, but if you were looking at a topographical map of Italy, you would notice that, get my pointer back here, you would notice a central mountain spine, central ridge, and like a feather, smaller ridges would come off from both sides of this central ridge. Now, American forces fighting in World War II would find how rugged Italy was and how it made it not a very ideal place to fight offensive warfare. At this time, it made it very difficult to travel around Italy. But Rome, however, has the asset of the Tiber, because this river, its headwaters, penetrate to the very spine that runs north and south, or maybe not north and south, but up and down the Italian peninsula. So Rome can benefit from trade coming down these mountain trails instead of over one ridge and then back up another. And this is shipped out down the Tiber River, shipped out through Rome to the entire Mediterranean basin, including, as I mentioned before, ancient Greece, but also North Africa, Southern Europe, and what will become Spain over here. Now, in 509, Rome's elites depose their king. Instead, they form a republican form of government. Now, the Roman constitution divides the functions of government among councils and an assembly. Now, the assembly is the Senate. The Senate is the center of power initially in ancient Rome. The assembly, or the Senate as the Romans called it, was made up of elected individuals who were elected by Rome's property elite, and of course they themselves were property elite, so-called patricians. Now, this Senate would choose 2 consuls for 1-year terms. The maximum that any consul ever served was 2 years. Now, the consuls are tasked with the executive function of government. They carry out the laws that the Senate passes. They also command Rome's armies. Now, as your book points out, and it does a pretty good job doing this, but I won't belabor the point and go into all the details. There are other positions within Rome. One of them is the praetor. The praetor has the same power as a consul. However, they're not tasked with carrying out the laws like an executive would. Instead, they're tasked with carrying out the laws like a judge would. Their function is to administer justice, not to carry out or administer the laws like the consuls were. Now, let's look at the Senate. It's made up of the leading aristocrats in Roman society. They acted as advisors and ratified all major decisions. Now, theoretically, at least according to the Romans, the Senate represented all of Rome. Now, you might be asking, how can a representative body that is only elected by property holders represent all of Rome? Well, like Athens, the property qualification was to seek men who were invested in Roman society. They had something at stake if their decisions were faulty. According to this logic, those that didn't own property didn't have anything to lose, and so they could not be relied upon to make good decisions. And so property qualifications hopefully got the best men into office. Now, this didn't fit well with all of Roman society, as we're going to see, because the Senate was only elected by and made up of the patrician class. These are the wealthy landholders, wealthiest merchants. They're the top 10% of society. And of course, the Senate is the top 1% of society. The vast majority of Romans are plebeians. These are commoners, craftsmen, lower-level merchants, small-scale farmers, and of course the poor. And as Rome grows, as we'll see, there's 2 other classes that will start to exert their power and have influence on Roman politics. As Rome expands, it will need an ever-increasing army, and this army will have an influence. There will also be an increasing numbers of slaves. Now, these slaves will not be able to exert their authority directly, but their presence will influence the development of Roman society. Now, there's one last interesting element laid out in the Roman Constitution. This is, let me just bring this up. That's the dictator. The dictator was an individual that the Roman Senate invested all of its power in during times of crisis. So if Rome experienced a crisis at home or a war abroad, the Senate could give one man dictatorial power. Now you might be asking, why would you want a dictator? Well, at this time, dictators, or the title of dictator, did not have the same negative connotation that we use today. The Romans didn't want Rome to fall victim of internal squabbling when there needed to be a quick decision. So a dictator made sense. And they limited the power of the dictator to 6 months. However, during this 6 months, dictators were all powerful. They could kill anybody they wanted, order somebody arrested and thrown in prison or even executed. They could pass any law that they saw fit. And you might be asking yourself, if somebody had this much power, why would they give it up? Well, early on, it actually did work. This is a picture that you see on the slide of Cincinnatus. Of course, this is the Roman that Cincinnati is named after. Cincinnatus is noted because he not only served as dictator once and gave up power, he served as dictator twice and gave up power. Now, Rome's development did not happen without problems. Just 100 years, or actually less than 100 years, after the founding of the Roman Republic, tensions between the patricians and plebeians came to a head. In 494 BC, the plebeians actually threatened to leave Rome and establish a rival settlement outside of the city's limits. They argued that they were not being represented by the Senate. So as a result, the Senate allowed the plebeians to have 2 representatives. These were known as tribunes. And over time, these tribunes would, become very powerful and even more numerous. Your book points out that from 2, they would go to having 5 tribunes. But besides having the tribunes, plebeians could vote themselves. If I'm pronouncing this right, they could call for a plebiscita, which is an opinion of the plebes. Now, this is important because these plebiscitas, this is where the term plebiscite comes from, is where the plebes actually express their opinions and demand action. Now your book on page, let me see if I can find it really quick. There we go. Also points out that there are other another council, and this of course is the Council of the Plebes, or the Council of Plebs. So you have competing councils. You have the Senate with the senators, you have the tribunes, and then you have the Council of Plebes, and then of course you have the plebiscite itself. So supposedly this would represent all of the people. However, throughout Roman history, this will not be the case. Because one thing is interesting about these different councils and different positions. They will be dominated by patricians. Because in Rome, to serve as a senator, to serve as a tribune, or even to serve as a bureaucrat, you didn't get paid. You might be asking, well, why would anybody want to work for the government if you didn't get paid? Well, according to the Romans, it was an honor to serve Rome. Now, this sounds fine and very honorable. However, there's ulterior motives. With this service comes power. Senators passed laws. Tribunes spoke for the people, spoke for the plebeians. And so wealthy patricians would serve as senators and tribunes, seeking election if they were a tribune, or seeking appointment to the Senate from their fellow patricians. Of course, they didn't have to worry about being paid. Patricians were independently wealthy. They were large landholders or already wealthy merchants. Of course, we see this today in our own government. We see, like our governor of the state of Tennessee, Bill Haslam. One reason why he is able to run for governor and pay the election is because he owns Pilot Gas Corporation. So this is not far different from our own politics today. Now, as Rome evolves, plebeians are allowed to become office holders. However, they still do not get paid. In the 3rd century, the tribunes and the power that they wield, combine with the Council of the Plebs and the Plebiscitus to start to overshadow the Senate itself. Again, though, the patricians are still very powerful. So even though these plebeian assemblies appear to start to rival the Senate, remember, the tribunes and many of the office holders are still patricians because they have to fund their own work. Now, as Rome expands, it takes on more territory. The first territory that, of course, Rome conquers or incorporates into the city-state here is what we call Italy today, the Italian boot. Now, after incorporating Italy and the northern part of Sicily, the Romans grant citizenship to their fellow Italians. Your book calls them fellow Latins. This will not be the case as Rome expands beyond the boundaries of the Italian peninsula. And even though these fellow Latins have citizenship in this new Roman society, they are still not considered at the same status as those from Rome. Rome and Romans still are supreme. Now, as Rome expands, it will come into conflict with another powerful city-state, and this is, right here, Carthage. Carthage is more of a maritime power than Rome is. Rome is a land power, getting most of its experience and expansion expanding on the Italian peninsula. Carthage has already started to set up colonies here in southern Sicily, Sardinia, and on the coast of what is today Spain. And of course, this will bring it into direct conflict with Rome, because Rome favors city-states here in the north. Carthage has alliances with city-states in the southern part of Sicily. So, around 264 BC, Rome, in support of a city-state in Sicily, will declare war on Carthage because Carthage is allied with a rival city-state in southern Sicily. The Carthaginians and the Romans will fight over this, and the Carthaginians will lose. They're forced to pay tribute to Rome. And of course, this First Punic War, as it becomes known, ends in 241. Now, some Carthaginians, this leaves a bitter taste in their mouth. One of them is a leading elite of Carthaginian society, and this is Hamilcar Barca. Barca will teach his son, Hannibal, to hate anything Roman. And so in 218 BC, Hannibal will attack Roman settlements here. Again, get my pointer working again. Here in Spain. And again, Rome will be at war with Carthage during the Second Punic Wars. Now, Hannibal, instead of attacking Rome directly, either here in Sicily or on the southern part of the Italian boot, he takes his army against Rome's, what you might call, safe backyard. Advancing from Spain along the coast, he attacks northern Italy, trying to drive a wedge between Rome itself and those Latin territories that it had first conquered. At the Battle of Cannae in 216, the Romans have an army that is completely destroyed by Hannibal. Hannibal is an excellent military tactician, and he introduces things such as elephants on the battlefield. He brings elephants from Africa and marches them into northern Italy. Now, this is one thing I need to point out at this time. The Italians, or not the Italians, the Romans, while not being a very innovative people, they are a persistent people. This is one thing that historians have noted about Romans. Romans, at first, were not a maritime people. They traded with other societies, but it was mainly the mariners and sailors from other societies trading in Rome. But during the First and the Second Punic Wars with Carthage, Rome will basically mimic its enemy Carthage, will use its strengths to its advantage. One of the interesting things that the Romans do is in fighting the Carthaginians on the Mediterranean Sea, is they take land warfare onto the water. Instead of fighting ship to ship, which the Romans have little experience with, they will use grappling hooks to capture an enemy ship, to tie it to their ship, and then they'll have Roman legionnaires on board that literally march across onto the enemy ship and wage a small land war at sea. And for the Romans to lose an entire army at Cannae, this is something that the Romans simply shrug off. They build another army. Now, the Romans will catch the Carthaginians off guard because instead of sending their new armies against Hannibal in the north, instead, they will send their armies directly against Carthage, forcing Hannibal to withdraw along this long line of retreat in order to make it back to North Africa and defend his home city-state. And so, near the end of the Second Punic War, which will end in 202 at the Battle of Zama, the Roman commander Cornelius Scipio will defeat Carthage and defeat Hannibal. Hannibal is forced into exile. And of course, Scipio is given the honorable title of Scipio Africanus after Rome's new colony of Africa, as it becomes known. Carthage is forced basically to divest itself of all of its colonies. So at the end of the Second Punic Wars, the only thing that remains of Carthage is the city-state itself. They have to give up all of their colonies here in Spain and all of their lands in North Africa. However, this still doesn't satisfy many in Rome, many leading leaders in Rome. And so Rome will declare war on Carthage a third time, so the Third Punic Wars. And what this does is it eliminates Carthage from the map. And so the Punic Wars end in 146 BC. Now, the defeat of Carthage and Rome's continued expanse into the Hellenistic world of Greece, here into Asia Minor, and of course North Africa, has an incredible effect on Roman society. Because when they capture Carthage, Carthage is sort of the extreme example of what the Romans do to societies that they conquer. When they capture Carthage, they enslave the entire population. And so when they bring this population back to Rome itself and sell these individuals, they're not just selling farm laborers. They're not just selling people to work in the fields. They're selling educated individuals, teachers, scholars, professionals, merchants, accountants. And what do you think this does to the job market, to the economy of your average Roman? Well, what this does is it brings in an exceptional amount of wealth. But the wealth is unevenly distributed. The patrician class benefits the most. They're able to afford to buy slaves, not just to work their latifundio, these large estates that the patrician class has, but they're able to hire these new slaves to work in mines, quarries, but also to work to teach their kids, to be the accountants for their businesses, to be the craftsmen who build things for them, to maintain their vast estate. So why do they need to buy the services of free Romans? Why do they need to go and hire somebody when they can own somebody? And so what happens is the gap between rich and poor gets incredibly wide in Roman society at this time, because the patrician class, with their latifundia, their states, are reaping the lion's share of the benefits of this slave labor, while free Romans are impoverished. And of course, this creates political and social tension again in Rome. So that by the 1st century BC, Rome is starting to enter a state of civil strife. Now, at the same time, the administration of Rome is changing as well, because let's look at the map here again. Rome was founded as a city-state. Its government organization, the Senate, for example, they were created to govern something the size of Knoxville. Now, Rome is expanded to Gaul, to Spain, to North Africa, to Greece, to Asia Minor, and now it's making inroads into what we call the Holy Land, into Palestine. How do you govern this with a government that was designed for a city? Well, what happens is you have to build a civil administration. You have to hire a lot of bureaucrats. And so what happens is, between the founding of Rome and the 1st century BC, these provinces, as they become known, are governed not directly by the Senate, but instead by provincial governors. The army and the civil administration is staffed with various levels of bureaucratic administration. And so what happens is, these bureaucratic institutions and the men who staff them start to have more power than the elected assemblies of Rome. They wield an incredible amount of power. So keep this in the mind, keep this in the back of your mind as we talk about some of the problems of the civil strife that comes around the 1st century BC as well. Because civil war is going to break out. This civil strife is best illustrated by a reform effort aimed at decreasing the power of the wealthy patricians with their latifundia and giving power to, and as well as land to, the plebeian class. A tribune, who is a patrician himself, a tribune by the name of Tiberius Gracchus in 133 BC, puts forward a reform program where there would be limits on how much land a patrician or anybody could own, thus keeping these huge latifundia from developing. And since there would be limits placed on land, that would make land more available, at least in small plots, to the less wealthy, free Romans. Well, Tiberius Gracchus is assassinated that same year because he goes against the wishes of the Senate and instead approaches the Council of the Plebs, trying to get this organization to justify the reform effort. And of course, the Council of the Plebs votes to pass this bill. Of course, this meets with resistance from the patrician-dominated Senate. Now, Tiberius's brother, Gaius Gracchus, will continue this push for land reform until he himself is assassinated in 121 BC. Now, despite the fact that these two brothers are killed, they are still supporters of land reform. One of them is the general Gaius Marius. Gaius Marius is a successful military commander in the Roman army. Now, in 87 BC, Marius marches his army on Rome and places the city under military occupation. Now, what is Marius doing during this military occupation? He is trying to reform Rome along the lines of Tiberius Gracchus. Now, of course, Marius has an ulterior motive. In doing so, he is currying favor with the plebes, with the plebeian class. But in doing so, he is gaining the resentment and opposition of the patricians. He also has a personal enemy who is also a powerful commanding general in the Roman armies. And this is Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Now, Sulla has a personal beef with Marius, because how military commanders gained fame, and with that fame came power in ancient Rome, is by leading successful campaigns. Well, Sulla had been scheduled to lead his army into Syria to conquer it. Marius pulled some strings in the Senate in order to get himself named as commander of this expedition. And of course, he is successful, and it gives him the honors and success that he desires in order to climb up the political ladder in Rome. And of course, Sulla holds this against Marius. And so, when Marius dies the next year in 86 BC, Sulla moves in to replace him. By 83 BC, Sulla and his army is in Rome, and Sulla is using this army basically to impose his will against the reform movement, reestablishing the rights of the wealthy landholders, and also hunting down supporters of Marius and killing them. So you have civil strife and near civil war that's going on in Rome during this time period. Well, Sulla will finally give up power and will die in 78 BC. And this will create a power vacuum in Rome. Into this vacuum steps three men. A man by the name of Crassus, another by the name of Pompey, and then another man that you might recognize, Julius Caesar. They form what is known as the triumvirate. The triumvirate is simple. They will share power and try and reform Rome while at the same time placating the patrician class. Stabilizing Rome is their primary objective. However, these individuals are, well, ambitious in their own right, and they are politically opposed to each other. When I say politically opposed to each other, that they see each other as potential threats. Now, Crassus is killed while on campaign leading his army, And this leaves Pompey, who is a strong commander in his own right. He has his own army, vying with Julius Caesar. And Caesar himself leads an army. At the time, Caesar is leading his army on campaign in Gaul. Now, Caesar is highly successful. He is the only Roman military commander to have defeated the Gauls and placed Gaul under Roman authority. And of course, this comes with honors. It comes with prestige. And this threatens Pompey. And so Pompey declares Julius Caesar a traitor in 48 BC. And so, or I should say, in 48 BC. No, 50, sorry, going the wrong direction here. 50 BC. We count down in BC, not 80. So in 50 BC, a year before 49 BC, because 49 is an important year. Sorry, I'm losing track of time here. In 50 BC, Pompey, who is ruling in Rome at this time, declares Julius Caesar to be a traitor, to be a threat to Rome. In response to this, Caesar in 49 BC marches his army to Rome. Now in January of 49 BC, he makes a momentous decision to cross the Rubicon. Now the Rubicon is a northern river that historians still don't know exactly where it is because we don't know the modern name of this river. But under Roman law, it was considered illegal for any Roman commander to bring his army into Rome and cross the Rubicon if he's coming from the north. And so when Julius Caesar decides to cross the Rubicon, he is making the decision that he's not turning back from this, that he's going to do what Marius and Sulla did and take his army into Rome. And they basically do an illegal thing, to perform an illegal action. Well, he crosses the Rubicon, forces Pompey to flee, and as such declares himself to be consul. Now this is important because Caesar doesn't declare himself to be consul for just 6 months. He first declares himself to be consul for 10 years and then declares himself to be consul for life. So in effect, he is declaring himself to be emperor, but just by another name. So what are Caesar's policies? Well, Caesar begins the process of centralizing the military and politics under himself. Remember that bureaucracy I was telling you about? What Caesar does is he basically removes authority over the civil administration, removes the Senate as the head of the civil administration, and instead places the bureaucracy under himself. So what had been in place and had evolved to administer the growing territorial empire that was Rome simply had the representative body shoved aside, the Senate, and replaced with a single man, Caesar. Now Caesar recognizes also the danger of having private armies running around that were not immediately loyal to himself. Because let's step back a minute and let me tell you something about the Roman legions. At the time of Caesar, soldiers did not declare their loyalty to Rome. They declared their loyalty to their general. Because the reason why wealthy patricians like Caesar, like Marius, like Sulla, were also the commanders of the Roman legions is because they're the ones that paid them. These legions were raised from the wealth of wealthy patricians. The military commanders paid their soldiers and their lower level officers. they outfitted them. And of course they commanded them in battle. So they wielded a huge amount of influence over their soldiers. And this is one reason why Caesar was able to march his army illegally into Rome. Caesar continues to garner the support of his army by confiscating property from conservatives that had opposed him and distributing it among the veterans of his armies and other political supporters. But at the same time, Caesar starts the process, he won't finish it, but starts the process of taking power away from these wealthy patrician generals and trying to make it so that Rome controls the armies, not their generals. He also starts large-scale building projects in order to provide employment for the poor. He extends Roman citizenship to people in the provinces, so now they can vote. Now they can make their voices heard. Now you might be going, this sounds great. Caesar sounds like Jesus. He's ministering to the poor. He's giving rights to the people. But you always have to look at the ulterior motives, because Caesar is currying favor with the poor by providing employment. Because at this time, you have a large segment of the population that is poor because they've been replaced by slaves, as we were talking about. By extending citizenship to the people of the former conquered territories, Caesar is becoming their savior, if you will. He is currying favor so that they will support not just Rome, but support him. Now, Caesar's policies will not sit well with some people. He alienates friends and foes alike. The wealthy patricians will actually hatch a plot to assassinate Caesar. And so on the steps of the Senate, after Caesar addresses the Senate in, I believe, 47 BC, let me see if your book actually gives a hard date, so hold on please real quick. I don't have it in my notes. Let's see here. No, not 47 BC, 44 BC. I apologize for the delay. In 44 BC, on the steps of the Senate, patricians that he had just got done addressing, senators, corner Caesar and start to stab him. One of these was the senator Brutus. Now, Brutus was a man that Caesar had grown up with, considered a friend, and supposedly Caesar's last words were, "Et tu, e Brute?" You too, Brutus? And despite being assassinated, Caesar will have made his mark. Because even though Caesar is assassinated, the pendulum of history is already pushing Rome toward an imperial form of government. They're not going to go back to the republican form of government because Caesar has a protege. This is the man who will finally replace Caesar. This is Octavian. Octavian was Caesar's nephew and adopted son. He will also hunt down the conspirators like Brutus and either kill them or force them to commit suicide so that they're not captured and tortured. They're also rivals trying to gain Caesar's position. And so Octavian will have to fight against them. Most notably, one of them is Mark Antony, a popular commander of a legion, and also the lover and supporter of the Egyptian pharaohess Cleopatra. And so Cleopatra and Mark Antony join forces trying to seize power of Rome. However, Octavian's navy will catch the combined fleets that are allied with Mark Antony and Cleopatra off the coast of Actium, Greece in 31 BC. Now, Cleopatra's is on sort of what you might call this big dual-hull floating ship. And just before Octavian's naval forces surround her naval forces and of those of Mark Antony, her ship is able to escape. She thinks Mark Antony has died. And, of course, as the story goes, she will take an adder to her breast, the snake will bite her, and she will die. She commits suicide. Mark Antony will be hunted down and be forced to commit suicide himself by Octavian. Now, after seizing power, Octavian will be bestowed, he will have bestowed upon him the title of Augustus by the Senate. Now, Augustus has religious connotations in the Roman religion. So now you have this semi-divine emperor, and it is Octavian who takes on the title of Imperator. That's where we get our term emperor. And of course, the Imperator is the all-powerful ruler. And as the emperor, Augustus will rule unopposed for 45 years as I say, a monarchy disguised as a republic. And thus, by 27 BC, the Roman Republic, even though there is a shell of it still remaining, the Senate is still there, people still view it as a republic. It is no longer a republic. It is a political empire. All power flows from the emperor through the bureaucracy, through the army. And this bureaucracy and the armies are loyal to Augustus. So let's look at how Augustus gets this loyalty. Well, he took responsibility for all governmental functions. Provincial governors are awarded their positions by Octavian and, of course, the later emperors, and they can be removed by the emperor. They are invested with power. They make decisions on their own without having to consult the emperor in the name of the emperor. As long as they follow the general guidelines of the emperor, they literally run their provinces as they see fit. Augustus also will reorganize the Roman legions. Instead of wealthy patricians raising and financing an army, Rome will pay for the army from its own coffers. So, soldiers are not paid by their military commanders. They're not equipped by their military commanders. They are paid and equipped by the Roman government headed by the emperor. And so, Roman army commanders are appointed rather than a person who basically raises a legion to serve Rome. And so this position is dependent upon their personal relationship with the emperor, because if the emperor can give them a command, the emperor can take it away. And they don't have 100% loyalty of their soldiers anymore, because they're not the ones paying those soldiers. The soldiers are loyal to Rome, not their commanders. Now, you might be saying, this sounds all terrible and everything. Well, not initially. Because Rome under Augustus, under Octavian, his original name, and for the early part of the empire, is relatively stable. After years of political tension, after years of expansion at the borders of Rome, Rome is now a large, powerful empire. As you can see by this map, circa 117 AD, Rome now encompasses modern-day Spain, France, the lower part of the British Isles, Italy, the lower part of Germany, modern-day Switzerland, Greece, the Balkans, Turkey, all the way over into what is Iraq, the Holy Land, and all of North Africa. Since they controlled the entire coastline of the Mediterranean Sea, they called it Mare Nostrum, which means our lake, our ocean. Now, more importantly, the Roman Empire, at least from 27 BC to 180 AD, will experience a time of peace and prosperity that is often known as the Roman peace, or Pax Romana. This peace is brought on by the fact that you now have an empire with a uniform law, a uniform administration, with all power emanating from the emperor. However, the real foundation of this peace are the Roman legions, because it is the swords of the Roman legions that enforce Rome's dictates. So on the one side, Roman citizens can feel assured that no matter where they go in the empire, the laws are going to be the same. They can feel safe that anybody that tries to harm them will have to deal with Roman justice. But at the same time, you don't screw with Rome. At the same time, you don't protest too vehemently against Rome. Because if you do, Rome will send its vast armies out to destroy you, to enslave you, or to kill you. And so this is the empire as we see it at the turn of the millennium, from BC to AD. At the time of Christ, Rome has made this transition from a territorial empire to an empire that has an imperial form of government. Now, next class period, we'll talk about how this empire continues on, and finally how this empire collapses. Because imperial forms of government have a natural weakness, and we'll talk about those natural weaknesses in the second part of our discussion about Rome. But before I leave you guys, let's just quickly review the differences between a republican form of government and a government under the empire. In the Roman Republic, you have representation, consuls in the Senate, and the tribunes. You have the dictators, but they only serve a limited amount of time. Now, while there is representation, and while there are attempts of resolving conflict between the patricians and the plebeians, this class conflict is a chronic problem of the Republican era in Roman history. Now let's look at the empire. Julius Caesar and later Octavian will centralize authority unto themselves. They will basically be the source of all power in Rome. They will initiate a time of stability, trade, communication, and uniform law. But at the same time, this imperial form of government will be only as strong as, of course, the quality of whoever is heading this empire. And we'll see how this can mean that the empire is strong and stable, but what happens if you have somebody who is corrupt, somebody who is incompetent, or somebody who's just flat out crazy in the position of emperor? We'll talk about this next class period. So, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've gained something from it. I hope you guys will be reading along with this, because your book actually is quite a pretty good Western Civ book, and it fleshes out some of the points that I've talked about tonight. So I'm going to get off right now. I'm going to finish this lecture and convert it to an MPEG-4, and I will see you guys later on. Thank you very much. Bye.